Let's quickly review what we covered in the last video. If you haven't watched it yet, I would encourage you to do so, as it sets the stage for this one. So there's a link in the description. What we're doing is using the circle of fifths to find chord substitutions and passing chords. So there are 3 rules that we looked at. Rule number 1, you can often use the chord directly across the circle as a substitute for the chord you are playing. So say, for example, you're playing this progression, C minor 7, F7, B flat. You can go directly across the circle to find a substitute for that F7 chord. Rule number 2, you can often use that same chord, the one directly across the circle, as a passing chord in addition to the original chord. So here's the original chord, and then this B7 is now a passing chord. And then in rule number 3, you can often precede the chord you are playing with the chord which precedes it in the circle. So say, for example, you're playing a progression where you're on a G7 chord for 2 beats, which then resolves to C. So you can delay the G7 until the second beat and play the chord which precedes it in the circle on the first beat. And that chord happens to be a type of D chord. It could be D minor 7 or D7. And it would sound like this. Or now, let's apply these rules to a portion of a famous standard. And if you haven't heard of this song, I would encourage you to find all the versions you can and listen to it, because it is a beautiful song. It's called All the Things You Are, and the music was composed by Jerome Kern. And so we're going to take a look at chord substitutions and passing chords, but first we're going to take a quick look at how Kern composed this song around the circle of fifths and how he uses the jump across the circle technique. So let's switch to the overhead camera and take a closer look at this song. You'll notice that the key signature is 4 flats, and the first chord is F minor. And the next chord is B flat minor. B flat minor happens to be the next chord in the circle of fifths. Then the next chord after that is E flat, or E flat 7 in this case. That's next in the circle. Now, can you guess what the next chord will be? Well, it's also the next chord in the circle, A flat, or in this case, A flat major 7. Now, what do you think the next chord after that would be? Well, it just happens to be D flat major 7. How could you miss that? Why, you could practically play this song by ear if you know the circle of fifths. But now, on the next chord, Kern throws a curve. He gives us G7. G7 obviously is not the next chord in the circle after D flat 7. It is the chord which is located directly across the circle from that D flat 7 chord. So he's used the jump across the circle technique to continue his song. And now he starts using the circle all over again, beginning on the G7, because the next chord is C, or you could play C major 7. And then he changes the C major chord to C minor and starts going through the circle all over again. So beginning on the G7, and then it goes to C minor, and now we're going through the circle again. Goes to F minor, or F minor 7, the next chord in the circle. And as we continue the song, we can see how Kern has used the circle of fifths and has also jumped across the circle. So we have C minor, F minor, B flat, E flat. And so it's interesting. It's like the first 4 bars, and then all of a sudden we jump across the circle and then change that major chord to minor. And now we're doing the same thing as we did in the first several measures, but now we're in a different key. And then he jumps across again. Now we could keep going, but what we want to do now is let's take these first few measures. I think we're going up here to like measure 15, maybe 14. And we're going to use some of the chords. We're going to put in some of our own chords, essentially, and kind of rearrange this song. We're going to make it even jazzier than it is. On first glance, this looks pretty complex, but now you can see how Kern, the composer, by using the circle of fifths, was able to create this beautiful chord progression. And then by jumping across the circle, he was able to create a little bit of a surprise for us, but then continue to use the circle of fifths. So let's put in some of our own chords using the rules that we have discussed. In the third measure, for example, let's use another chord instead of E flat 7. So what can we do to find a possible substitute for this E flat 7? Remember rule number 1. Let's look directly across the circle. And what do we find? A7. Now that we have the A7 chord in there, in place of the E flat 7, let's apply rule 3, and we'll put a filler or a passing chord in front of it. So what is the chord which precedes A7 in the circle of fifths? Let's use that just before we use the A7. And so we end up putting in an E minor or an E minor 7. That's pretty wild, isn't it? And so by using the circle of fifths, we have substituted 2 chords for the E flat 7. And so now what we're doing, of course, is we're leaving the sheet music arrangement and creating our own styled interpretation. Let's jump down to measure 11. We have a B flat chord. So starting at measure 9, we have this B flat 7 chord. Now we could find a substitute for that B flat 7 chord. So first, we find the substitute by looking across the circle, and the substitute is E7. And it just happens to work perfectly because the melody is D. So D fits right into the B flat major chord, or the B flat 7 chord, I should say, and it also fits nicely into an E7 chord. Now, we can use a passing chord by finding the chord which precedes the E7 in the circle. And that just happens to be a B chord, some type of B chord. Now, since there is a D in the melody, we need to use B minor. Now it sounds like this. That's starting to sound pretty jazzy, isn't it? Now we can go all the way down to the 14th measure, and we can apply all 3 rules. So if you look at that bar, look at those measures, you find that there is a D7 for 4 beats. We can play an A minor 7 before the D7. That's rule number 3, you remember. you can often precede the chord you are playing with the chord which precedes it in the circle. So here's that D7. We can add in, as a passing chord, a chord based on A, which precedes D in the circle. Now, since the melody goes up to an E flat, we're going to add an A minor 7 flat 5. So remember, this is A minor 7. We're going to flat the 5th. After the D7, we'll substitute A flat 7. That's rule number 1. We're jumping across the circle to get to that A flat 7 chord, which happens to work because C, which is the melody, fits into the D7 and it fits into the A flat 7. So we have something now that sounds like this. We're playing some really nice jazzy chords now, aren't we? We can also just ignore the D7 altogether and substitute the A flat 7 for it. That's rule number 1, jumping across the circle. But we can still keep that A minor 7 as a passing chord. Here we go. This demonstrates how the passing chord, this A minor 7 flat 5, we put that in instead of the D7. It can also become the passing chord for the substitute of the D7 chord, which is A flat 7. Now, once you come to understand the power of the circle of fifths, you'll begin to see how useful it is and how often it has been employed by songwriters who write these amazing chord progressions. You may have to watch this video and the one that precedes it. You may have to watch them a few times so that all of this can sink in. So don't give up on learning this. It's one of the keys to understanding how music works. Thanks for watching. I hope you have found this helpful. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave those in the comment section. I will be sure to respond. If you'd like to support my work, you can go to my Patreon page, and the link will be there in the description. I look forward to speaking to you in the next one.